At dawn, the Apache woman spoke. "I'd rather die than belong to you." The sun had barely begun to rise over the jagged mountains when the Apache woman woke. She moved quietly among the tents of her village, careful not to disturb anyone still sleeping. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and the soft smoke from last night's fire. She loved this hour, when the world seemed calm and full of promise. Every day brought new challenges, but in these early hours she felt connected to the earth, to the sky, and to her people. Her name, though small and simple, carried a weight of history and pride, and she wore it like a second skin. From a young age, she had learned the ways of her people. Her mother taught her to recognize the tracks of deer and mountain lions, to know which plants could heal and which could harm. Her father showed her how to shoot an arrow with precision and how to move through the forests without making a sound. Her grandmother whispered stories of their ancestors, tales of bravery and wisdom that stretched back generations. These lessons were not just about survival, they were about life, about understanding the world and the place one held within it. The village was small, made up of several families living in tents and simple structures. Each person had a role, and every day was a rhythm of work, care, and preparation for the seasons ahead. The woman had responsibilities too. She helped gather food, carried water from the stream, and tended to the younger children when their mothers were busy. But more than anything, she valued her freedom, the freedom to think, to move, and to choose. This freedom was not something given, it was earned every day, through skill, courage, and respect for the land and her people. That morning, however, there was a quiet unease in the air. The birds seemed to sing less, and the wind carried a strange scent. She noticed it as she walked along the path to the stream, a sharp tang that set her senses on alert. The elders had warned them of the dangers beyond the mountains. Settlers and soldiers were moving into Apache territory more often now, bringing weapons, diseases, and a hunger for land. Most days these threats felt distant, like stories from another world. But that morning the danger felt close. By mid-morning, the village had become alive with activity. Children ran barefoot across the earth, their laughter carrying across the valley. Women prepared food over open fires and men checked their weapons, tightening straps and sharpening blades. The woman joined them, moving with ease and confidence. She carried a small basket of herbs she had collected, and as she walked, she hummed a tune her grandmother had taught her, a melody that seemed to make the trees sway gently in rhythm. Suddenly, the air was filled with a strange, heavy sound. It started as a distant noise, almost like the rumble of thunder, but it grew louder with every second. The woman's heart raced as she looked toward the horizon. Dust rose in the distance, moving fast, driven by men on horseback. She recognized them immediately. They were not her people. Her body stiffened and she ran to the center of the village, shouting for her family. Chaos erupted. Men grabbed their weapons and formed a line, trying to protect the village, while women screamed and pulled children to safety. The woman ran toward her mother, who was already gathering her younger siblings. Her father shouted from the other side, urging everyone to flee into the mountains, the one place they still hoped would keep them safe. The sound of hooves grew louder, echoing like drums of war, and the village was surrounded before anyone could escape. The attackers came quickly, breaking tents and shouting orders. The woman tried to fight, using the skills her father had taught her, but there were too many. Her arrows flew, precise and sharp, but each one was met with resistance. Hands grabbed her, pulling her from the ground, and she felt the cold weight of fear pressing down on her chest. She struggled, but it was useless. Her freedom, which she had known since birth, was slipping through her fingers like sand. They bound her hands and forced her onto a horse, the leather straps cutting into her skin. She could see her village behind her, burning in patches, smoke rising into the sky. Her friends and family were being taken, scattered, or worse. Her heart ached with the knowledge that this day would change everything. She looked down at the ground which had been so familiar, so safe, and she felt a deep sorrow. But within that sorrow a spark remained, an unbroken flame of defiance. As the horse carried her away, she noticed the landscape changing. The mountains, which had always been her refuge, now seemed distant and unreachable. Rivers glimmered far below, their paths twisting and turning like the challenges ahead. She thought of her grandmother's stories, of ancestors who had faced danger with courage and cleverness. She promised herself that she would not surrender her spirit. No matter what lay ahead, she would remain true to who she was. During the march, the captors spoke harshly, trying to break her will with words and threats. They told her to obey, to accept her place as a captive, to forget her past. But she remained silent, refusing to answer. Every step she took, every glance she gave, carried the message that she would not be tamed. At night, when the others slept, she would close her eyes and picture the mountains of her home, the faces of her family, and the warm sunlight on her skin. These thoughts became a shield, protecting her mind even when her body was controlled. Food was scarce, and the journey was long. She watched the sun rise and set, marking each day with patience. She noticed the changes in the land, how the trees grew thinner, how the air became drier, and how the soil turned rocky and uneven. Each step was a lesson in endurance, teaching her to rely on her instincts and her strength. She found ways to survive, stealing small portions of food, drinking from streams, and resting whenever possible without drawing attention. Even in captivity, she found ways to assert her freedom, however small. One morning, as the first light touched the horizon, the woman spoke for the first time since the capture. Her voice was calm, steady, and filled with quiet authority. She told her captors that she would not belong to them, that her spirit was her own, and that she would never be broken. The words surprised them, for they had expected fear, tears, or submission. Instead, they heard defiance, a refusal to surrender, even in the face of power. From that moment, the journey changed. Though her hands remained bound and her movements restricted, her captors began to watch her differently. They saw that she was not like the others who had been taken before. Her eyes were bright, unyielding, and full of life. She moved with purpose, and each small act carried a dignity they could not take away. The woman understood that freedom was not only about the body, it was about the mind, the heart, and the soul. As the days passed, she began to observe her captors closely. She learned their routines, their weaknesses, and their patterns. She listened to their conversations, noting who was cruel and who showed even a hint of kindness. Each observation became a tool, a way to survive and protect what remained of her spirit. She discovered that the world beyond her village was harsh and unforgiving, but it was not without order, and understanding that order was a key to survival. Despite exhaustion and fear, she never allowed herself to feel hopeless. Every sunrise reminded her of her promise, to remain true to herself. She thought of the mountains, the streams, and the firelight of her home. She imagined the songs her grandmother had sung, the faces of her siblings, and the stories that had shaped her life. These memories became a lifeline, a way to hold on to identity when everything else seemed lost. By the end of the first week, it was clear that the woman's strength was remarkable. Her captors whispered about her courage, unsure of how to handle someone so unbroken. She had survived without surrender, without complaint, and without losing the essence of who she was. In her silence and quiet determination, she had already begun to shape the story of her life, one that no one could rewrite. At dawn on the 8th day, as the sky began to glow with soft shades of pink and gold, she raised her head and spoke once more. Her words were simple but powerful. She would rather die than belong to anyone who sought to control her. In that moment, even the wind seemed to pause, carrying her declaration across the open land. It was a statement of unyielding courage, a reminder that freedom is not given, it is defended in the heart. As the sun climbed higher, she rode on, her spirit unbroken. Each step of the journey was a test, but she faced it with patience, courage, and a quiet strength that could not be measured. Though the mountains behind her were now distant, she carried them within herself, a constant source of guidance and hope. She knew that the path ahead would be difficult, but she also knew that no chains, no force, could take away the inner freedom she had vowed to protect. The Apache woman's story had begun, not with victory or triumph, but with endurance and unyielding spirit. The dawn had witnessed her courage, and the world would never see her the same way again. Even in the shadow of captivity, she had found a way to assert her identity, to preserve her dignity, and to show that true freedom comes from the strength within, not from the circumstances outside. The Apache woman had been taken far from her home, into a land that was strange and foreign. Every tree, every stone, every sound seemed unfamiliar. The ground beneath her feet was uneven, and the air smelled differently, carrying scents she had never known. She moved quietly as she always did, aware that every step was being watched. Her captors did not understand her, and that gave her a small advantage. They saw her as a person to control, a possession to be owned. But in truth, she remained free in ways they could not reach. Her first days in the settlement were the hardest. She was given a small, cold space to sleep, far from warmth and comfort. The food was strange and meager, and she did not recognize most of it. She had learned to eat what was available, but her stomach ached with hunger and worry. The people around her spoke in a language she only partly understood. Their words were harsh, clipped, and meant to remind her that she was powerless. She noticed the glances of curiosity and sometimes even of fear. They had never seen someone so young, so small, yet so unbroken. The woman quickly learned that obedience was expected. She was told when to eat, when to work, and when to sleep. Her movements were restricted, and her voice was often silenced. Many captives she had heard about from travelers had submitted quietly, accepting the harsh life without complaint. But she refused to be like them. She moved with purpose, even in confinement, and she carried herself with the dignity her ancestors had taught her. She knew that strength was not just physical, it was mental, emotional, and spiritual. Despite the control surrounding her, she found ways to keep her traditions alive. She would whisper the old songs her grandmother had taught her, just softly enough to hear herself. She recalled the stories of ancestors, the lessons about courage, patience, and cleverness. She remembered which herbs healed wounds, how to find water in dry places, and how to read the stars at night. Each small memory became a lifeline, reminding her that she was still herself, even when her body was in chains. The people of the settlement tried to change her. They gave her a new name, clothes that were tight and strange, and rules that made no sense to her. Some tried to teach her their language quickly, hoping she would forget her own. Others laughed when she refused to follow their orders exactly, but she remained patient. She learned just enough to understand what was necessary, but she did not give them her mind or her heart. Her silence became a weapon, a way to resist without open confrontation. She observed everything. She noticed who among them was cruel and who showed even a small spark of kindness. She paid attention to the routines of her captors, their habits, their weaknesses, and their strengths. Every observation was stored in her mind, ready to be used if an opportunity came. She realized that survival was not just about avoiding harm. It was about understanding the world around her and using knowledge as her shield. Work in the settlement was hard. She was asked to fetch water from distant wells, to clean and cook, and to perform tasks meant to remind her of her status. The labor was exhausting, but she approached it with quiet determination. She did not allow herself to be broken by fatigue or humiliation. Even when her hands were raw from work, she held her head high. Other captives watched her in awe, some whispering their amazement at how she refused to give in. She became a symbol of quiet strength, even if she did not intend to. At night, when the settlement was quiet, she would find small ways to feel free. Sometimes she would sit by a window and watch the stars, remembering the skies over her home. She traced constellations her people had named and whispered their stories softly. Other nights she would touch the earth beneath her feet and imagine the mountains she had loved, the rivers she had crossed, and the forests where she had once moved freely. These moments were private, sacred, and vital. They reminded her that her spirit was not captured. The captors tried many ways to break her. They scolded her for small mistakes, threatened punishment, and sometimes tried to isolate her. But she adapted. She learned to appear compliant while keeping her true thoughts hidden. She listened more than she spoke, moving with caution and patience. She understood that outward submission did not equal surrender. Even if her body was forced to obey, her mind remained hers, untouchable and free. Over time, she noticed that some of the people around her began to speak differently of her. They could not understand how someone so young could resist so calmly. Some whispered in private, fearing her courage might inspire others. Some were frustrated, feeling powerless in the face of a captive who would not bend. And some, quietly, admired her. They saw that her refusal to yield was not anger or stubbornness, but something deeper, a true and unbreakable strength. One morning, she was ordered to help prepare food for a group of visitors. The work was repetitive and exhausting, but she carried it out methodically. As she worked, she spoke softly to herself in her language, recalling the words of her grandmother. "Your spirit is stronger than any chain. No one can take what is within you." Each word reinforced her resolve. She knew that her life was dangerous, that mistakes could be punished harshly, but she also knew that losing herself was a far worse fate than any hardship. Children in the settlement sometimes approached her. They were curious about her strange clothing, her quiet ways, and the stories she never told. She smiled gently at them, offering small gestures of kindness without revealing her secrets. She understood that even small acts of care could form connections, and she found a measure of comfort in these tiny bonds. They reminded her that life, even in captivity, could still contain moments of humanity and warmth. Weeks passed, and the routine continued. Yet the woman's mind never rested. She planned carefully, thinking about how to survive, how to maintain her dignity, and how to honor her people. She realized that patience was as powerful as any weapon, and that time could shift power in subtle ways. Her captors underestimated her because they could see only what she allowed them to see. Inside, she was always preparing, always learning, always resisting quietly. One evening, a new captor arrived, a man who had heard stories of her courage and came to see it for himself. He tried to frighten her, to test her obedience and to see if she would finally submit. But she remained calm. She looked at him directly, meeting his eyes without fear. Her gaze was steady, and though her body was confined, her spirit radiated strength. The man, who expected terror, was taken aback. He had underestimated her, and the realization unsettled him more than any display of anger could have. Her life in the settlement was harsh, but it was also full of lessons. She learned who to trust, when to speak, and when to remain silent. She learned how to find small comforts in a harsh world, like listening to the wind through the trees, feeling the sun on her skin, and remembering the taste of home. Each day she became more skilled at navigating captivity without surrendering her identity. Her mind was free, even if her body was not, and that knowledge gave her courage. Her captors continued to challenge her, testing her limits in new ways. Sometimes they asked her to perform tasks that were impossible or meant to humiliate her. Other times they tried to isolate her completely, hoping loneliness would weaken her resolve. But she endured, finding ways to maintain her sense of self. She would hum the songs of her people quietly, recall the stories of bravery, and think of her family. Each act, no matter how small, was a defiance against the control imposed upon her. One morning, as the first light of dawn spread across the settlement, she realized something important. Her body could be restrained, her movements limited, and her surroundings controlled, but her inner self, the part that made her who she was, could never be taken. Freedom, she understood, was not only a physical state, it was a matter of the mind and heart. She had already begun to teach this lesson to herself, and silently to anyone who might be watching her courage. By the end of the first months in the settlement, her presence had begun to affect others. Some captives drew strength from her example, seeing that resistance was possible even in impossible circumstances. Some captors grew wary, realizing that she was not simply a broken person to command. Her quiet dignity had a power they could not measure, and through it all, she never lost hope. She held onto her memories, her skills, and her pride, knowing that these things could never be taken from her. Every day she remembered her home. She remembered the mountains, the rivers, the forests, and the people she loved. She remembered the firelight, the songs, the laughter, and even the hardships of village life. These memories were her armor, shielding her from despair and giving her the courage to endure. She knew that no matter what the world around her demanded, she could remain true to herself. One morning, as she tended to her tasks quietly, a thought came to her. Freedom could not be given, only defended. She understood that even small acts, speaking in her own language, remembering her songs, keeping her head high, were acts of defiance. And she understood, too, that courage often went unnoticed by those who lacked vision. She could not control the world outside, but she could control her spirit. And that, she realized, was more powerful than chains, threats, or confinement. The days in the settlement had grown longer and heavier for the Apache woman. She moved through her routine with quiet precision, carrying out the tasks demanded of her, but never losing sight of her freedom in spirit. She had learned to read the moods of her captors, to know when to speak and when to remain silent. Every glance, every word, every gesture was carefully measured. Even in captivity, she maintained control over herself, and that control gave her a sense of power no chains could take. Despite the constant watch of her captors, she found moments to reflect on her life before the capture. She thought of the mountains she had climbed, the rivers she had crossed, and the forests she had roamed freely. She remembered the laughter of her friends and the gentle guidance of her elders. She remembered her mother's hands, strong yet tender, and her father's careful instructions on how to survive in a world that was sometimes harsh and unforgiving. These memories were her sanctuary, a place she could return to whenever the present became too difficult to bear. Her inner strength became more apparent to those around her as time passed. Other captives noticed the way she carried herself, calm and steady, even under pressure. Some began to look to her for guidance, silently taking cues from her courage. Her captors, too, could not ignore her presence. They saw that she would not break, and this realization unsettled them. Many tried to intimidate her with harsh words and threats, but she met their attempts with quiet defiance. She understood that fear could only control a body, never the mind or the heart. One day, the settlement's leader summoned her. He was a man used to obedience, to people following orders without question. He spoke sharply, demanding that she accept her place and serve without resistance. He expected fear or submission, but she gave neither. Instead, she looked him directly in the eyes, steady and calm, and refused his demands with quiet strength. Her gaze was unwavering, and her voice, though soft, carried a weight he could not ignore. He realized for the first time that she could not be owned. The man left, frustrated and unsettled. Others began to whisper about her courage. Some were afraid of her spirit. They had never encountered anyone so young yet so unyielding. Others admired her silently, though none dared speak openly. Even in captivity, she had become a symbol, a reminder that freedom is not always a matter of place, but of heart. She understood this fully, and it gave her hope. As the weeks passed, pressure increased on her to surrender completely. They tried to isolate her from others, hoping loneliness would weaken her resolve. They attempted to change her daily life, forcing her to adopt their ways, their language, and their rules. Yet she adapted carefully, complying outwardly when necessary, but never giving them the core of her spirit. Each small act of endurance was a defiance. Every quiet refusal, every inner victory, strengthened her resolve. At night she would retreat into her thoughts, remembering her home and her people. She imagined the warmth of the sun on her face, the sound of flowing rivers, the scent of wild herbs, and the laughter of her family. She recalled the songs of her ancestors, the tales of courage passed down through generations. These memories were not just comfort, they were tools of survival. They reminded her that no one could take what was inside her. They reminded her of who she was and what she stood for. Her captors noticed this unbreakable spirit. They saw how she carried herself, how she interacted with others, and how she resisted their attempts to control her. Some were angry, unable to understand her strength. Others were cautious, realizing that her courage made her unpredictable. A few, in quiet moments, even admired her, but admiration or fear did not change the rules imposed upon her. She remained under constant watch, her movements restricted, and her freedom limited. Yet her mind and heart remained untouchable. One morning, the woman was given a new task. She was to deliver messages between the settlement and a distant outpost. The work seemed simple, but it was meant to keep her occupied and under observation. She walked carefully, observing every detail along the way, the paths, the trees, the people she passed, and the subtle dangers that could appear without warning. She learned more with every step, storing knowledge in her mind. She understood that observation and patience were as powerful as any weapon. During this journey, she reflected on the meaning of freedom. She understood that her body was captive, yet her spirit could remain untouchable. She realized that true freedom was not the absence of chains, but the ability to choose one's own thoughts, one's own actions, and one's own values. Even in the harshest circumstances, she could preserve what mattered most: her dignity, her courage, and her identity. These thoughts strengthened her, making her resilient in ways her captors could never comprehend. As the days turned into weeks, she began to understand the limits of her captors' control. They could force her body, but they could not command her mind. They could dictate her actions, but they could not change her values. They could surround her with walls and guards, but they could not imprison her spirit. This realization became a source of power. She moved with careful strategy, always thinking ahead, always preparing for what might come. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, she observed her captors in a new way. She noticed their weaknesses, the moments of carelessness, the moments when their focus wavered, and the small acts that revealed their true nature. She began to plan, not with violence but with patience and cunning. Every observation was a step toward ensuring that she could survive, and perhaps one day reclaim her freedom. Her mind was sharp, and her courage unwavering. The people around her began to sense that she was different from anyone they had encountered. Her calm in the face of threats, her quiet defiance, and her unwavering dignity made her stand out. Others began to speak of her in hushed tones, wondering how someone so young could resist so completely. Even her captors, who prided themselves on control, began to treat her differently. They were cautious, unsure of how to handle someone who refused to be tamed. Weeks later, she was confronted directly. The leader of the settlement demanded that she accept her life fully, that she submit completely, and that she abandon her past. The woman listened carefully, her heart steady and her mind clear. She knew that this was a moment of truth, a choice between surrender and defiance. She considered the consequences, the dangers, and the risks, but her values, her dignity, and her spirit were stronger than any fear. As dawn approached, the woman made her decision. She would not surrender. She would not belong to anyone who sought to control her. She understood that living without freedom, without dignity, was worse than death itself. Her choice was clear, and her resolve unshakable. She had lived long enough to know that true courage is not measured by the absence of fear, but by the ability to act according to one's principles despite it. At first light, she spoke. Her voice was calm, steady, and filled with strength. She declared that she would rather die than belong to anyone who did not respect her freedom. The words rang out like a bell in the quiet morning. They startled her captors, who had expected fear, tears, or compliance. Instead, they heard defiance, courage, and the unshakable truth of a spirit that refused to yield. Her declaration was more powerful than any weapon, more formidable than any threat. The moment changed everything. Her captors realized that they could never truly control her. They could bind her hands, restrict her movements, and impose rules, but they could not own her mind or her heart. Her courage forced them to confront their own limitations. They had underestimated the power of a spirit determined to remain free. Even those who had doubted her began to respect her, though none dared say so openly. From that day forward, the Apache woman's life in the settlement took on a new meaning. She continued her work, continued her careful observations, and continued to live with patience and intelligence. But she did so with the knowledge that she had asserted her freedom in a way no one could take away. She had shown that courage and dignity were not dependent on circumstances, but on the strength of the individual. Her quiet defiance inspired others. Captives who had once felt hopeless began to look for ways to preserve their own dignity. Some captors, seeing her unyielding spirit, began to treat others with a little more respect. The woman's courage was not loud or violent. It was subtle, persistent, and undeniable. She had turned a situation meant to destroy her into a lesson in the power of the human spirit. As the weeks and months passed, she remained vigilant. She continued to plan, observe, and endure. Her mind was always active, always aware, always prepared. She understood that the future was uncertain, but she knew that no matter what happened, she would remain herself. She would not compromise her values, her courage, or her dignity. She would live according to the principles that had guided her since childhood. By the time the seasons began to change, the woman had become more than a captive. She had become a symbol. Her quiet strength, her refusal to submit, and her unwavering spirit were remembered by all who saw her. Though the settlement sought to control her, they could not erase her presence or her impact. Her courage was a reminder that even in the harshest circumstances, freedom is a matter of the heart and mind. The morning sun broke slowly over the horizon, casting long golden rays across the settlement. The Apache woman stood quietly, feeling the warmth on her face, but her mind was clear and determined. She had made her choice, spoken her truth, and declared that she would never belong to anyone who did not respect her freedom. The words she had spoken at dawn had echoed in the hearts of those who heard them, changing how they saw her forever. Though her body was still in captivity, her spirit had already soared above every chain. Her captors watched her carefully now, unsure of how to respond. They could see her strength and courage, but they could not understand it. Many of them were unsettled, realizing that their control over her was only temporary, limited to her body. They had tried to break her to make her obey, and to erase the person she had always been. But they had failed. In their eyes they saw someone they could never fully possess, and in her own heart she felt a quiet satisfaction. She had proven that true freedom could never be taken. Days passed with a careful rhythm. She continued her daily work, moving quietly through the settlement, observing, learning, and planning. Her captors continued their attempts to control her, but she met each challenge with patience and calm. She did not rush, she did not panic, and she did not allow fear to guide her actions. Every step she took, every decision she made was guided by her inner strength. She understood that endurance, courage, and intelligence were as powerful as any physical resistance. Even in the small moments, she maintained her dignity. When given orders, she performed them, but always in her own way, efficient, careful, and purposeful. She kept her head high, her eyes steady, and her mind alert. Other captives began to notice her example, finding hope and courage in the way she lived. Even those who had felt defeated or hopeless could see that it was possible to preserve one's spirit, even in the harshest circumstances. The woman also observed the settlement itself. She noticed weaknesses in their routines, small cracks in the walls of their control. She watched the guards, listened to their conversations, and studied the patterns of daily life. She understood that knowledge was power. Even without open rebellion, she could maintain her safety and dignity. She began to plan carefully, imagining ways to protect herself and, if possible, find a path back to freedom. But she did not rush. Patience was her ally, and she understood that timing was everything. One evening, she spoke quietly to a young girl who had become curious about her. The child had asked about her people, her songs, and her home. The woman smiled gently, teaching her simple words in her language and sharing small stories about the land she loved. She did this carefully, knowing that even small acts of kindness could create bonds and preserve humanity in a harsh world. These moments reminded her that courage was not only about defiance, but also about love, compassion, and connection. The days turned into weeks and the weeks into months. The seasons changed, painting the land with new colors, new temperatures, and new challenges. The woman adapted, learning to live with her captors without losing herself. She remembered the mountains, the rivers, and the forests of her homeland, and she carried them within her. These memories were more than nostalgia. They were guidance, wisdom, and a shield against despair. She understood that the spirit cannot be chained if the mind remains free. One morning, as the sun rose, she faced a new challenge. The settlement's leader demanded that she perform a task designed to humiliate her, to remind her of her place. But she approached it with calmness, completing it efficiently yet with quiet dignity. Her actions spoke louder than any words. She showed that respect cannot be forced, and that courage can exist even in the smallest of deeds. Those who observed her could see her strength, even if they did not fully understand it. Her reputation grew within the settlement. People spoke in hushed tones about the young woman who had refused to be broken, who had faced captivity with courage and intelligence. Some feared her, some respected her, and some were inspired by her example. She did not seek attention or praise. She simply lived according to her principles. Her life became a quiet lesson for others, that true freedom is a matter of the heart and mind, not the walls around one's body. As time passed, the woman began to consider the future. She knew that her body was still in captivity, but her mind and spirit were free. She began to plan carefully, thinking about ways to reclaim her freedom without risking her life unnecessarily. She studied the movements of her captors, the routines of the settlement, and the natural paths of the land. Every detail mattered, and she understood that preparation and patience were essential. Her strength was not only in courage, but also in wisdom and foresight. She also thought about her family, her village, and the people she had left behind. She wondered if they were safe, if they remembered her, and if they had survived the attack. These thoughts were bittersweet, filling her with longing and sorrow, but also with determination. She knew that she carried the spirit of her people within her. Their teachings, their courage, and their love were a part of her, giving her strength in the darkest moments. One day, as she moved through the settlement, she noticed a small group of captives whispering among themselves. They were young and frightened, unsure how to navigate the harsh life imposed upon them. She approached them quietly, offering gentle guidance and reassurance. She taught them how to maintain dignity in difficult circumstances, how to observe carefully, and how to preserve hope. Through these small acts, she extended her courage and wisdom, helping others find strength even in captivity. Her actions did not go unnoticed. Some captors began to recognize that she was more than a captive. She was a force of character, intelligence, and spirit. They realized that they could not fully control her, no matter how many rules or threats they imposed. Even those who disliked her found themselves compelled to acknowledge her strength. And yet, she did not let this recognition change her. She remained humble, patient, and focused on her own path. As months turned to a year, the woman's courage became legendary within the settlement. Others whispered stories of her defiance, her intelligence, and her unbreakable spirit. Some captives began to hope that freedom was not impossible. Some captors reluctantly began to treat her with a measure of respect, though no one ever dared to say it openly. Her life had become a lesson in perseverance, courage, and the power of the human spirit. One morning, she awoke with a sense of clarity. The sun was rising, casting light over the settlement, and she realized that she had survived not because of luck, but because of patience, intelligence, and courage. She had preserved her dignity, protected her spirit, and inspired others. She understood that freedom is not only a physical state, but a matter of inner strength. And she knew that whatever happened next, she would face it with the same courage she had shown from the first day of her captivity. The final challenge came quietly. Her captors, realizing that they could not fully control her, offered her a choice. They could keep her in captivity forever, or they could allow her to leave under their supervision. She considered carefully. Freedom had always been her goal, but it was more than simply leaving the settlement. It was about reclaiming her spirit and her life on her own terms. She knew that even small steps toward independence mattered, and she was ready to take them. When she finally walked beyond the walls of the settlement, the air felt different, fresher, and sweeter. The sun warmed her skin, and the wind carried the scent of open land. She moved carefully, alert to every sound, but her heart was full of hope. Every step was a reminder that she had survived, that she had maintained her spirit, and that she had chosen courage over submission. She was free, not only in body but in mind and heart. As she traveled, she remembered the mountains of her homeland, the rivers, and the forests. She thought of her family and the people who had shaped her life. She knew that the journey ahead would be long and difficult, but she also knew that no obstacle could take away her courage. She had faced captivity, threats, and uncertainty, and she had emerged stronger. Her spirit had not only survived, it had grown. When she finally reached a safe place, she looked back once, thinking of the settlement and the people who had tried to control her. She felt no anger, no desire for revenge. Instead, she felt pride and clarity. She had survived, preserved her dignity, and maintained her freedom. She had shown that even in the darkest circumstances, courage and patience could lead to survival and hope. She had turned captivity into a lesson in the power of the human spirit. Her story did not end there. Others remembered her courage, and her example spread quietly, inspiring people who faced hardships of their own. She had become a symbol, not because of fame, wealth, or power, but because of her refusal to surrender, her unwavering dignity, and her inner strength. Her life was a testament to the truth that freedom begins in the mind and heart, and that courage can shine even in the darkest times. Years later, when people spoke of her, they did not speak of chains or captivity. They spoke of a young woman who had chosen courage over fear, dignity over submission, and freedom over comfort. They spoke of her strength, her wisdom, and the way she inspired others simply by being herself. Her story became part of the memory of her people, a legacy of defiance and hope that would never be forgotten. Even as she grew older, she never forgot the lessons of her early captivity. She continued to honor her ancestors, to remember her home, and to live with courage and integrity. She taught others what she had learned, that true freedom cannot be given or taken but must be claimed within. She reminded them that no one can truly own a person who refuses to surrender their spirit. And through her life, she showed that courage, patience, and dignity are the greatest forms of freedom anyone can possess. The Apache woman's journey had begun with violence, fear, and captivity. It had continued with quiet endurance, intelligence, and defiance. And it ended with freedom, not just in the physical sense, but in the deepest sense of mind, heart, and soul. She had faced the impossible, survived the unthinkable, and emerged stronger than anyone could have imagined. Her life became a story remembered by those who valued courage, integrity, and the unbreakable strength of the human spirit.